I would like to invite my first speaker and speaker for today's meeting, which is Altaf Kazi. Altaf is an NHSBT Head of Faith and Belief Engagement. I'm really happy to invite him today and excited to listen to him because he is working in the NHSBT. We've been working with them for a year or two. We've had lots of patient partners, but we have somebody who really understands the faith issues and his backgrounds. So Altaf, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum and jazakallah khair for joining us this evening, mashallah. So my theme and topic that I'm going to talk about is organ donation and deemed consent. And what I wanted to do is just really break it down and give everybody an understanding of when we're talking about organ donation, what is the size and scale that we're actually talking about. So if we move on to the next slide, it will really kind of give us an understanding around, the numbers of people that have actually, that we're talking about. And these are some numbers that are taken from 2018, but I want you to kind of like just share this with you, just to give you that scale. So if you look at the top, you've got a UK population of around 65 million. In the UK, we have approximately 600,000 deaths. Deaths in hospital is then around 290,000 deaths. But not all of those deaths will be eligible to become organ donors. When we break that down to the pool of potential donors, and this is the amount of donors that could exist from these 290,000 deaths, at that that first check, we're left with 7,281 people. Following on that, we look at eligibility, and we see that there's 6,038 people that are eligible. So you can see the number is really, really getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so when it gets down to actual donations in 2018, the number of actual donations was 1,574. And this is what I wanted to show you, this triangle and how this actually looks. Because it's also important to kind of like understand that there's also a number of people that are waiting for organs as well. So your actual donors is like 1,574. The transplants that take place of 4,030, sorry. And the organs transplanted are 4,473. Now, I've said a lot of numbers, and I'm cognizant that I've said them very quickly. And what I wanted to do is really just reflect on the way that these numbers break down and how they get much, much smaller. Because this is an important theme that's going to run throughout what we go through. So if we move to the next slide and we look at the current day figure, right? The current day figure. So these are taken from the last organ and transplant report, which was shared on the first slide. You can kind of go back to that and have a look at the link itself. The link itself is www.odt.nhs.uk, and you can find more information about some of the facts and figures that I'm going to give you for today. So moving back onto slide 4, when we look at how many people have had their life saved through organ transplantation, this year, we can kind of look through those numbers, and the latest number for the last year were 4,761, right? So that's how many have had their life saved through organ transplantation. The question is, how many people are currently waiting for transplant? And we can see that there are 6,138 people that are currently waiting for a transplant as of that date. Of this, approximately 31% of this list come from the Black, Asian, or minority ethnic communities, which is startling because it's 31%. And if you look at our level within the population, so kind of like if you break that down and say, okay, so how do we look as a group against the wider population, just from a wider demographic when we're not looking at organ donation? So the BAME community accounts for around 14% of over 16-year-olds that would kind of like be included within some of these numbers. And if you're looking at a general population level, then you're talking either 17% or 19%. So the BAME community within the UK are around the 17 to 19% of the total population. However, it's quite interesting that that BAME communities make up 31% of those people that are waiting for transplant. And if we look at the number highlighted in the yellow, in the pink below, I think it's quite important to have a look at that as well, because approximately 1,100 people a year die due to the lack of donated organs. So 1,100 people have died due to a lack of donated organs. Moving on to the next slide and just kind of like breaking down into that, into the BAME community ever so slightly more. This year was a 5-year high for people from BAME backgrounds that were receiving life-saving organs. There were fewer transplant, and that was because of the pandemic that's taken place in the last year, and that, you know, we had to stop the amount of organs that we were able to, you know, to transplant in a safe mechanism and manner. Our research kind of shows that 64% of the BAME community are willing to donate, and they said they would be happy to donate all of their organs. And this is up from 51% from November 2019. So we can see the trajectory is going in the right direction. And kind of our plan from NHSBT is really to look at targeting national media with separate versions and really kind of understanding that BAME kind of that BAME title. And I'm not one for titles like BAME. I really like breaking that down and looking at the different communities that exist within that. So when we're talking about Black, we're talking about African, we're talking about Afro-Caribbean, and understanding the nuances within that. When we're talking about Asian, we're doing the exact same. We're looking at the Indian community, the Pakistani community, the Bangladeshi community, and other communities as well from within Asia, and understanding the nuances that exist there and how we best and most effectively communicate with them. We're also kind of like looking at issuing press releases to high BAME population areas and really doing some heavy PR work in that area as well. So that's an overarching view of organ donation in terms of what types of numbers that is, organ donation from a BAME perspective at this current moment. But we know that the law has recently changed. And if we move on to the next slide, you will start to see that the legislation changes are related to Max and Kira's law. This is a law change that has taken place on the 20th of May. And what this was really about is kind of moving the discussion of organ donation on. Now, there's some great confusion around organ donation and what it actually means. So what I wanted to do is just give you these two simple slides, right? Because I think the language of opt-in, opt-out, it sometimes gets really confusing for people. So I wanted to kind of break it down and say, take it away from that language and let's just look at it for what it is. So what it means, it's a shift of presumption in favor of organ donation to reflect views of the majority of the UK population. The choice remains with the individual to opt in, opt out, nominate a representative, or do nothing. So the individual makes the choice. The family will be approached to determine the last decision. So we will always go and speak to the family and ask them about what was the last decision of the person, unless they've kind of like, you know, really made it. That they've opted in on the organ donation register, and we can see that they've opted in and they've made a clear decision. We'll still check with the family just to make sure there were no changes. And this strengthens our ability to have discussions with families when it comes to, you know, different faiths and beliefs. And what happens is that at the point of organ donation taking place, the clinical leads, they will have that discussion. But there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to organ donation. And the change in law. The change in law doesn't mean that organs now will be taken without consent, right? So people think, oh yeah, you know, somebody hasn't opted, sorry, they haven't opted out, so they've automatically opted in and we're just going to take organs now, right? That's not the case. Organs will be taken without consent is a myth. Right, the decision continues to rest with the individual and the discussion with the family. The family will not it does not mean the family will not be approached. We will always speak to the family to determine the last known decision and seek medical information as well. Right, so we need to have these conversations. That's important that we have these conversations that take place. And I think that that's something that we have to maintain and remain focused on. So that's what I wanted to do, is give you a real high view of what the law change actually means. So the law change that came into force means that there's a presumption in favor of organ donation. However, the individual has the right to make a decision, and we will always consult with the individual, or we will consult with their family, right? And so they will be able to tell us or determine the last known decision that was made, and families will get a lot more support and assistance when it comes to faith and belief discussions. You know, there's a 100 on the organ donation register. Thank you very much for that, and we'll be taking any questions in the last towards the end of this session, from my understanding.
Okay. Altaf, thank you very much. Very clear understanding of what's going on. MashaAllah, we have 108 people on this call right now, so we're really reaching out there, and we'll be reaching out further. Please do respect the speakers. Please mute your mics when you do attend. We will obviously automatically mute you, but please mute your mic so everybody can hear clearly what the speakers are saying. So Also in the chat box, you will see the questionnaire. Please start completing that. I am really proud to present a leading light in the Muslim ulama, which is Shaykh Dr Rafaqat Rashid, who will be our next presenter. Most of you will know him. He has a very long bio, but he is the authority. At this moment in time, he's written a new article which has just come out and is heavy going. I'm trying to read it at this moment in time. But Sheikh is a polymath. He's a teacher, a leader. He works as a GP. He works in the CCG. And currently, he's a founder member of the Al-Baig Institute. And he's going to take us through the complexities of the Islamic faith and understanding of death itself and when death occurs. So Sheikh, please, you have the floor.
جزاكم الله خير. الحمد لله وكفى والصلاة على عباده الذين اصطفى سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. And first of all, I want to thank BAME for allowing me the opportunity to talk about a subject which is quite close to my heart. I've been working on this for some considerable amount of time. It's been a subject that's been sort of popping in and out of my life in terms of the academic nature of it. So it's a very challenging topic for ulama, for Muslim scholars, because it sort of transpires in many different subject areas. It goes into a number of different sciences. So so my role today, inshallah, is to simplify it. That's the first. The second is to sort of put to the forefront some of the important issues that Muslim scholars deal with when we talk about the issue of organ transplantation. And then finally, leave you with a summary of the things that would be important for you. So if we just move to the slide. So this is a list of all the things that we have. So just remind me when my time is over. So these are some of the topics regarding what we'll be talking about, or what I'll be talking about. It's just Islamic sources, opposing Islamic viewpoints, and the supporting Islamic viewpoints. Now this is a piece of work that I've been sort of working at for some time, and I'm trying to promote is the 3 prime descriptions of human bodily dignity. And I think biggest confusion when it comes to organ transplantation is that we broadly see what we call the karama, or the ikram of the human body, the honor that we give, the dignity of the human body, the sanctity of the human body. We sort of see as a broad sort of concept, but reality is it's defined in many different ways. So I sort of present a 3 prime description understanding of this. Then I will just outline something about defining death. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about death and also defining death. I've done a lot of work around this. I have a chapter that's coming out in a book that will be published soon. And I also have written an article very recently on the issue, which elaborates on some important points. Then some of the stipulated conditions. This is useful for yourselves. What are the stipulated conditions in donating organs? And then finally, just a brief overview about the conditions required for Muslims to approve the UK Organ Transplantation Process. It's just a few little things that are worth noting. So if we just move on. So there's very little discourse in classical Islamic texts because, you know, it's a new thing. You know, nobody ever thought that we could use human organs for life-saving therapy. You know, they were used as grafts historically. They were used as cosmetic sort of purposes. They were disliked. It wasn't commended that people were using human body parts in this particular way. However, you know, these things did happen, and the fuqaha did mention this. You know, the Muslim jurists did talk about this in some of the literature. But to use them for, you know, for purposes that are related to a person's survival was quite new. Nobody ever envisaged that until today. So there's a couple of topics that we make reference to. That's to do with ritual purity, funeral rites. So these are some of the chapters of books of fiqh that relate to the topic that you'll find that Muslim scholars make reference to. Okay, next slide. So there are 3 opposing Islamic viewpoints. There are others, but these are the 3 main things that people tend to argue in opposition to organ transplantation. The first is in terms of the sacredness of the human body. So the human body, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we have truly, in full honesty, honored mankind. The Bani Adam, the son of Adam, the children of Adam, we have honored them. So on that basis, there's a sense of dignity, there's a sense of sacrosanct in the human body. So on that basis, when we are using bodily parts, we're objectifying, using them as some kind of commodity that we can transfer, donate, and sell, and various other things. So you know, there's a serious opposition to this sort of approach to the human body. So for this reason, many would argue the case and say, hang on, look, operating on a deceased donor body to remove organs is an act of aggression or mutilation. So this is musla, this is aggression and mutilation against the sanctity of the body. So these kind of questions do arise. They come in many different forms, in different words are used to describe them. But generally speaking, you know, you'll find that this is the general main argument that is normally presented. Another argument is about the human body as an amana. So the human body is an amana. It belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It doesn't belong to us. It's on loan to us, if you want to put it that way. So in essence, there are so many things that we can't do to our body. وَلَا تُلْقُوا بِأَيْدِيكُمْ إِلَى تَهْلُكَ. Do not take your own body to, or your own life to destruction with your own hands. But rather, this is something that belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how can we donate something which clearly belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It's not, we don't have the milkiyat, we don't have the ownership of these organs, so how can we donate? So this is another common argument that's presented. And finally, we have the argument about the slippery slope, so the mafsada, as they would term in Islamic jurisprudence. So this is the argument that this is going to lead to exploitation. We're going to have some kind of sentiment regarding the human body, in the sense that there'll be reduced value in human bodily dignity. People will start using the body and abusing the body in many different ways. So on the basis of this, there's a common argument around this argument. So in this sense, it's important to realize that you know, these are quite important arguments. The thing. So this is the verse I was making reference to earlier on, and in this verse you will see, I mentioned وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. So here we have, you know, this is a broad understanding about there is some dignity in the human body. So Islamic legal sources are not very clear by dignity in the human body. So what does it mean by in terms of the integrity or the dignity in the human body? So you'll find, for this reason, because of this broadness, the only way we can sort of start looking at case studies within the fiqh literature, within the legal literature, Islamic legal literature. Okay, next slide. Okay. So this is a bit of a heavy slide, and I have no intention of going through this in detail. But the three prime descriptions that are recurring in all the fiqh literature that you'll find, and those of you who have read my paper will see the detail that I actually go into, are in essence related to the intactness element. So this is the concept of mutilation. So for example, and the functional. So the functional is about harming somebody. So if you're harming, so there's the element of darar. So there's a hadith, and there's also maxims of la darar wa la dirar. Do not harm and do not reciprocate harm. So to actually functionally harm somebody. So if there's a live donor, for example, and on the basis of a live donor, you're removing an essential organ, and that person is harmed as a result of this, then that would clearly breach the very important concepts within the Sharia, that we are harming another person or even taking their life. So this will be completely unacceptable. So that's the functional harm. Then we have another form of harm, or another form of human dignity issue, which is to do with the intactness. So this is where a person, functionally we cannot harm them, and this may be somebody who's died, but yet we can breach what we call the intactness hurma of the body, the intactness, sacredness of the body, in the sense that we start dissecting a dead body. So for example, post-mortems are things that you would have all heard of, in Islam considered as prohibited, unless there's a real valid reason. So on the basis of that, you can see that, you know, you can't possibly harm a dead body in the functional sense, but you can cause some harm to the dignity of the body, even in that case. So this is the intactness component. Then the final one is the objectification. There are others, but these are the three main ones related to organ transplantation. So objectification or commodifying the body is about using the body in an instrumental value, or you give it an instrumental value, like some kind of precious sort of stone or something along those lines. It's been given a value, and you can exchange it, you can transact it. So this is something that is not acceptable from the Islamic perspective when it relates to the body, and also to use parts of the body for purposes other than what it's been created for. So this is what we call taghayya fi khalqillah, or to change what Allah has created. This is considered as breaching important maxims of Islam. Okay, we'll just move to the next slide. So I've just mentioned this in essence. So you talked about the intactness element, we're talking about the functionality, and I've also talked about objectification, which is both in the instrumentality sense, which is using the body as an instrument, and also fungibility in the sense that you're transacting or using this as what we call ghayra mutaqawwam. So this is about using the human body in the sense that you're using it as something that's precious that you can trade, and clearly to sell human body organs would be unacceptable for that purpose. Okay, next slide. So if you just open up the whole slide in the summary. Okay, so in essence, I've just briefly outlined this. Like I said, I have no intention of going into detail. We'll leave that to the questions. But you can already see that when you talk about intactness hurma, you're looking at the dead. All four Sunni schools tolerate violation both in this state. I've already mentioned something about the living, so you need to ensure that we preserve the functionality elements. So if somebody's donating an organ, for example, it's important that that person is not harmed in any way in that sense. Okay, and then also there's a dignity element in the human body. There are a couple of cases which relate to the Muslim jurists talking about what we would consider today a cesarean section. So is cesarean section permissible? What you're doing if, for example, you're in a situation where unfortunately, quite traumatically, the woman, the mother dies, and then you're trying to basically clearly she's not going to be able to give birth. So on that basis, can you actually dissect the body? Can you dissect the body and remove the neonate or the fetus? And the response to that are varied amongst the Muslim jurists. So some basically say on the basis of that, because it's a need, it will be permissible. And that's the general consensus on the basis that if there's a good, what we call a ghalabat al-dhann, a predominant or dominant probability that the child will come out alive, then it will be permitted. So you can already see that there's a discussion about the issue of the intactness element. Also, there's a case of somebody swallowing some precious valuables or money or coins. Can you dissect the abdomen when that person has died to withdraw that amount when clearly that belongs to somebody? It's their inheritance. So in that sense, you can already see there's an acceptance even on that basis by the Muslim jurists. Okay, next slide. Keep going, keep going. We just talked about fungibility, so we don't need to go into the details of this. Just go to the next slide. So there's something about, right, so when we talk about amana, or the trust that we have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the body doesn't belong to us, then we will see in Islamic jurisprudence, what we have is this idea of the huquq Allah, huquq al-ibad. So these are the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the rights of the servants. And the jurists basically explain that Allah is not of need of any rights. Allah is independent of everything that is created. So on that basis, that Allah is not in need of any rights. So when we refer to the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in essence what that entails is the rights of the community. So this is one particular interpretation which is quite predominant. So on that basis, what you're doing is you're looking at it from the perspective that in certain cases when there is a need and a necessity, then on that basis, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will waiver his rights to fulfill a need of that individual or a need of society. So these are concepts that we call a dhurura, necessity, or haja, need, and these are certain paradigms of Islam that we use in cases of real need and an exception. So in other words, a person who's fasting, so clearly fasting is obligatory on individuals because of they're unwell or they're ill, For that reason, they are excused, and there are many verses of the Quran which relate to that. And this would be considered as a need or a necessity. So Allah's command of obligation is waived on the basis of their health. Okay, next slide. So when you are waiving a right of Allah and a right of the individual, which is a shared right, so the human body is considered as a shared right, and you're waiving Allah's right, then it becomes a right of the human, or the right of the abid, or the person himself. So when it becomes a right of the person, they have the right waived on the basis of necessity or dhurura. So from that particular perspective, that person now would require an autonomous decision to make a decision in terms of whether they would want to, in this case, donate organs. So this is the issue that arises here, because out of necessity, once it's fulfilled that condition, then that person can then donate their organ. But if they do donate their organ, we need consent from that individual to do that, because it's a right that Allah has waived to them. Okay, and this can be done on the basis of what we call a wasiyah. Wasiyah is relating to finance, but here in the lagwi sense, i.e. in the lexical sense, the same kind of idea is used here. And there are ways of describing that from the Shari perspective. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it requires explicit consent from that individual or their family, who will become the inheritors of their wealth, and hence they would become those individuals who become the advocates or the proxies, decision makers on behalf of that particular individual. Okay, carry on. Next slide. Okay, so this is just explaining the concept of necessity and what I just already explained. So it just elaborates on some of those points. We can move on to the next slide. So I'm just going to briefly just outline here. You'll see historically there have been many fatwa which have allowed and permitted organ transplants on the basis of certain conditions. These are just examples. If you move on to the next slide. This is another breakdown of something probably more prominent. Islamic Fiqh Council of Jeddah, Islamic Medical Association North America. So you see a lot of literature that comes from them about their acceptance of organ transplantation out of dhurura, out of necessity. So remember, that's the important thing to understand here, that when it comes to necessity, then it's permitted, but in normal circumstances, it will not be permitted for you to donate your organs in that sense, or even to accept organs. Okay, next slide. So this is a nice little summary of the views. I don't intend to go into the details of that, but generally speaking, it gives an outline of what I'm going to explain in the next 2 to 3 slides. So that would be more explicit, but this is it's useful. But the stipulated conditions here are: number 1, so organ donation transplantation is allowed in Islam under certain conditions. So clearly we're recognizing that it has to be under the remit of necessity, so dhurura. Okay, so what kind of things can one donate? Single organs like heart, pancreas, and liver shall not be donated before death. So in other words, a person has to be considered as death from the Shari perspective. Donation should not be harmful for the donor. Okay, so you've got a live donor, it should not be harmful for them in any way. So we need clear studies that demonstrate that there is no harm to the one who donates, who is live. That's a live donor. So organ transplantation should be the last chance of survival. So in other words, what that really means is that we've exhausted other means. So you can argue and say, well, what about hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis? Isn't that another means? But no, from the Shari perspective, if it's just as effective. So if you find that there is no other means as effective as organ transplantation, so then you can use organ transplantation as a form of necessity. But clearly, if something arises tomorrow which is just as effective or more effective, then on that basis, organ transplantation would be considered as prohibited if that other means is considered as halal. So for example, we may be able to produce cloning of organs or something along those lines in the future. On that perspective, then to actually then donate organs would not be permissible if that was done at a large scale, and clearly we had the processes in place that would allow that to reach the general community. Now, transplantation should be mostly successful. So we're recognizing the prognostic indicators here. So this is to do with the success rate of organ transplants, and also ensuring that we have a good understanding about the sort of rates of morbidity or harm to those individuals who are donating. These things are to be taken into consideration when we consider this. The other point is donor should donate his organs of his free will. So informed consent is essential. And I know we are looking at the sort of opt-out system. So previously we had the opt-in system, which is to have a donor card, etc. in this particular way. But the opt-out system would be legitimized from the Shari perspective on the basis that if there was no advance directive, so if the person has clearly not indicated they want to donate organs, or they may have opted out, okay, already, then that's clear. If they opted out, that's clear. And if they haven't, and clearly we're not sure, because there's a deemed consent, on that basis, if the family are agreeable to that, then that would be sufficient from the Shari perspective. Okay, so the recipient should also consent to the procedure. That's the important part of this, that it's not just the idea that I want to donate my organ, but they should have some kind of understanding about what is the procedure they're expected to go. And this is all about informed consent, so they have a good understanding what it all means. There should be no monetary transaction or financial benefit from the procedure, because there's no need for this. The current system that we have allows for that. Why are you going to an area which clearly could have a lot of implications in terms of mafsada or a slippery slope, or where there could be serious amounts of exploitation? Okay, so next slide. So if the organ is taken from a cadaver, a dead body, in other words, the donor should be dead, clearly. Now the question arises, what does it mean by dead? And the donor should have stated in his lifetime that he wants to donate his organs, or there is clearly deemed consent on the basis that that's what the family are telling us. The relatives of the deceased should consent on the basis of that. Okay, next slide. Now, how much time do I have, Saeed? I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Yeah, Sheikh, you've got another 5 minutes, please.
Okay, that's fine. So I could quickly go over the whole concept of brain death with 5 minutes. Alhamdulillah. Okay, so I think this is really important point, because people get really confused about this. Now, when you talk about death, regardless of what your understanding is, you are accepting one of these three broad categories of death. Either you're accepting a traditional approach, you're accepting a whole brain death, you're accepting a high brain death. So on the basis of this, traditional death is what we consider irreversible loss of vital fluid flow, heart stops beating, blood flows limited, not passing around the whole body, brain's not getting enough blood, person becomes unconscious, and clearly, gradually, what you will see is clearly the heart stopped, the breathing stopped, the person's unconscious, and what we would do at that point is we say the person's died. Now, so that's the traditional approach, which historically has been the approach. Now, there's problems with that approach, and the problems with that approach is that we can now keep the body alive. We can keep that body alive, we can sustain that body, so the body is still pulsating, there's perfusion going around the whole body. The person may still be unconscious, or they may actually be in a state where there is no function of the brain. So from that sense, we could maintain that and sustain that person for a considerable amount of time using all the wonderful resources we have, claiming that this person is still alive. Okay, and this is a problem. So clearly our technology is not allowing us to take this definition any further, because there are problems with it. So on the basis of that, you'll find, sorry, if you just go back to the previous slide. Okay, the whole brain death or the higher brain death concept. So the whole brain death suggests that this is irreversible loss of integrated capacity. There are some issues with that. I'm not going to go to the depth of this, but generally speaking, the main approach from this is, what does Islam say? So we can't, from us, we have an Islamic tradition, which is rich. It gives us a lot of knowledge. Muslim jurists have talked about cases which would address some of these points. So I'm going to make reference to them as I go through the next 1 or 2 slides. So if you just go on to the next slide. But the main point to take from this is defining death is something that is accepted by the different sort of Muslim councils and resolution committees. And historically, there have been some who have rejected this idea of neurological death. I prefer to use neurological death than brain death. And for that reason, people are still have mixed views. Now, if you look at these papers that have been presented in these previous sort of resolution committees, I've got a lot of issues with them, because number one, they were presented by Muslim doctors who presented a completely secular approach to neurological death. So for that reason, some of the jurists from these conferences accepted that idea, others didn't. But reality is that that approach should have been different. And I'm quite passionate about this, and that's for the reason why I have an organization, Al-Balag Academy, where we educate Muslim doctors and people like that to actually speak the right language when they present to ulama, and so they have a good understanding of fiqh and so forth. But anyway, the main point to take from this is that Islamic tradition has quite a bit to say about this. If you just go on to the next slide. Okay, and just before I go on to the conditions, I'll just mention 1 or 2 things. If you just carry on, just go through the whole slide so that people can read it. The whole slide, yeah, yeah. These are things I've just reiterated before, and you can read this as I speak in the next few minutes. But the main thing is the Islamic tradition defines duality, or what we call the idea that dualism. So that is that we recognize there's a ruh, there's the soul, and there is the body. So we differentiate between the two. So we don't have this kind of secular idea about the idea that a materialist understanding of the conscious mind. So our mind is not material, it's not a substance. Our mind, part of it is part of the functionality of our brain, but there's a very important component of our mind, which is what we consider as, from the Islamic perspective, we call it as idrak. And this is that conscious higher functioning of our mind, which is determined by the ruh, it's determined by the soul. So clearly we differentiate between the body and the soul. So we know that a person dies when their soul leaves the body, but we're not going to know when does the soul leave the body. It's a metaphysical issue, it's not something that can be determined through science. So on the basis of that, the fuqaha have elaborated on this point on the basis of case studies. I'm not going to talk too deeply about the case studies, but the main point that they have come to in these case studies is when a person loses his functionality, the will, or willed movements are described, the ability to see, the ability to speak, and speak coherently, that is. And these are a number of attributes, and they're described as what we would consider in today's language as they become unconscious. If a person has become unconscious to the degree that they have no will, nor do they have any conscious thoughts, on the basis of that, that individual is what we would consider as a mawt al-hukmi, at the least. A mawt al-hukmi means it's a legal death or moral death, okay? As opposed to mawt al-haqiqi. A mawt al-haqiqi could also be used to describe this. So the fuqaha use these terminologies. So they give the description, probably the closest description you can have is sacrificial animal, where you cut the throat when you're sacrificing them. And there are certain reflexive movements that occur after. That is not to tell us that this animal is now alive. So the question arises, can you eat this animal? Have you done halal on this animal? And clearly the animal is considered as dead. So this is considered as mawt al-hukmi. And on the basis that you can actually eat the animal, is considered as halal on the basis. Whereas you're not eating an animal that's still alive. That's one reason. And there are many other things regarding qisas and corporal punishment and things like that. So this comes into a lot of detail in the fuqaha debate. So I elaborate that in one of my papers. But other than that, the main point to take is the Islamic tradition does recognize the idea of permanent loss of consciousness. Permanent loss of consciousness being a process or a definition or what we would consider as legal or moral death. Okay, so on the basis of that, looking into the system that we have in organ transplantation, there is what we call the dead donor rule. That would be an acceptable process to go through, inshallah. So I'll leave it at that point. I'm sure there'll be questions later on, so I'll be quite happy to answer your questions. But finally, your conclusion is organs can be donated, organs can be accepted. And remember, this is under the rules of dhurura, of necessity. As soon as the dhurura is lifted, they're not acceptable. The other point to raise from this is that doesn't, as Muslims, it's very important that we don't remain content with this system of organ donation, because it goes against the values of Islamic Sharia. Okay, rather what we should really be hoping for is alternative ways, advancing technology, using those unpreventative means, preventing people to actually end up in a situation where they need an organ. These are things that we should invest a lot of energy and time in, but yet the current situation that we're in, these things would be acceptable. It talks about carrying a donor card, but what that really means is you can opt in. That's fine. And then I elaborate on the issue of deemed consent as well. So these are all a rule of necessity, and we have what we call a rukhsa. So we have concession on this basis, so that's the main elaborate thing regarding the conclusion. So Jazakumullah khair. Hopefully that's been very useful, and I'll be happy to answer any questions later on, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Sheikh. That was quite an exhaustive review of the situation. We will need to digest that again. I think when people watch these, because they are being recorded, this particular session, but I'm sure there'll be lots of questions in Q&A, and I'm sure you'll be hanging around a little bit later on as we get through this. So please, in the chat box, you've seen we have turned it off due to some mishaps in the chat box, but the questionnaire is still there. You can link onto the questionnaire and go through that as well. Now, let's bring this to home now. So far, we've looked at the statistics, we've looked at the Islamic guidance on this, but what does it actually feel like to be a patient? So with great pleasure, I'm going to invite Jelina Rahman, who is a patient, but also has gone on with her life, a successful life in law, and she's a solicitor and has many awards where she comes from Scotland, but she's going to explain to us what it actually is like to be a patient. So Jelina, up to you.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and thank you for having me today. My journey started, well, I'm born and brought up in London, and so that's where my journey started. And at 17 years old, I was diagnosed with systemic lupus erythematosus. You have on the camera here, first of all, a picture of me when I was very ill. That was later on. Initially, I had lupus, which was an incurable disease. I was 17 years old at the time. Now, I'm going to talk to you about initially how things happened, and when the diagnosis took place. I knew very little, doctors knew very little, there was very little understanding. SLE is an incurable disease, and when I went to the doctors, they told me that my kidneys will eventually fail. What was happening was lupus was inflaming my kidneys, and they said once your kidneys fail, you're looking at a short-term life. This is something that we're talking about 25 years ago now, and it was quite a shock when you're told that at 40 years old you're not going to survive longer. And that's looking at curves, that's looking at the statistics, that's looking at graphs. And doctors were very open and honest with me, as I wanted an open and honest answer from them. I was treated with medication, and I had to hide a lot of things. I think the hardest part was the community, and dealing with this with the community that I came from, the Bangladeshi community, and being told not to mention that I was ill, being told not to mention that my kidneys failed. And a lot of my sisters that are listening today will understand that when you have a rishta, or you have any form of proposals coming to you at that time, it was almost taboo to talk about it. You couldn't talk about how ill you were. You couldn't, any illness that was displayed would be covered up by makeup. Anything that I showed would be, I couldn't talk about it with any of the rishtas. I had to say that I was very well and healthy. And I think that's the hardest part of, I found initially the hardest part, not being able to say anything with the community. And it was a time when we didn't have forums like this, such as the Zoom conferences. We didn't have people talking about it. None of the community came together. There was little research at the time. We've come a long way now, which you'll hear from other speakers talking about the research and how much has developed. And at that time, everybody just there was a little knowledge, and we heard the Honourable Sheikh talking about the people's perspective, the three proposals that he put forward, and the opposing scholars talking about the proposals that he had discussed earlier on today. Eventually my kidneys did fail. I was 26 years old, and I was admitted into hospital, and this is a photo that you see today. The line that you see was a temporary line. I had a reaction, and this is a hemodialysis. They had to put me on hemodialysis immediately. As you can see next to my neck, there's a line, and that's a temporary line. And what they were doing was the dialysis machine would clean the blood and why they would clean the blood is that what was happening to my kidneys was that all the poison, the urea, everything was going into my blood system, and it was making me very, very ill. And the only way to clean this was by the hemodialysis machine that you see and the blood going through. I faced more difficulties with my kidneys, and I was on hemodialysis for 4.5 years. That was very tough, but that wasn't the only part. I had to watch what I was eating. I couldn't have certain fruits. Couldn't have potassium, salads, all that. I couldn't take anymore. I wasn't allowed. That's called, that was damaging for me. I was limited to 1 liter of fluid a day, which was very, very hard. It was a very difficult time, and for 4.5 years I had to suffer just being on the dialysis. I did my best and tried to continue fighting as much as I could by continuing with my education, continuing with my law firm, continuing doing as much as possible. But sadly my illness deteriorated, and you'll see in the next slide I ended up with pancreatitis. I ended up coming down to 4 stones, 5 stones at the time. This is actually a picture of me a couple of days before being discharged. So this was me well enough to be discharged. I ended up with pancreatitis, and the illness had created, all I could say is that I was so ill that the doctors were concerned that I wasn't going to survive. You can still see that the bags were attached. That was the actually infection that they were trying to take out of my system. Now, the ironic thing about this is if you're going to have a transplant, you have to be fit and well. But the people that need it are very ill. And at that time, whilst I was very ill, they had to take me off the transplant list. I was not able to go on the transplant list, and that was a huge, huge blow to me and my family. And one becomes desperate at that point. How do you approach your family to talk about having a transplant? How do you approach your family to say, I am in desperate need of a kidney so that I can survive? And once again, it's a taboo subject. How do we approach it? It's very difficult for us to go to our community, especially when you come from a Muslim family, especially when a Muslim family are looking at opposing scholars and what it is to give your organ away, because we've heard from the Honourable Shaykh talking about the difficulties with giving your organs away and the different opposing factors. So again, I was faced with this. I was very ill, and I knew if I didn't get a transplant, I will eventually die. I was lucky to be diagnosed. I was lucky to have a transplant. On the first transplant call I got was at 3 o'clock in the morning. I had a phone call we were told in the beginning, when my transplant failed in 2006, I was told to keep a bag ready, a hospital bag ready, because you could get a call anytime. I actually thought that was going to be sooner, not 4.5 years later. And that again will be explained because of the BAME community, because of that blood type, because of the lack of donors. All those aspects meant that I would be waiting a lot longer than the Caucasian counterparts. So I felt that waiting all that time, my bag, sitting there, the hospital bag, the first call I got was in November. And at that time, November 2009, I was really excited. I thought, this is it. This is my chance to get my transplant. This is my chance to be, normal again, have a life again. But sadly, the transplant, the kidney that was traveling, I was told it was being flown to Scotland, was damaged en route. Now, that was 10 years ago. I'm now told that that same kidney probably could have been used because of the advanced research that has been carried out due to Kidney Research UK and the funds that have been raised. But at that time, the surgeon themselves had phoned me up. I remember Dr. Bust calling me at 3 o'clock in the morning, telling me to get ready. And then after that, I had another call saying that, sorry, the kidney's damaged. You cannot have a transplant. And that's really hard to understand. And at one point I was so desperate, my husband and I were desperate, saying, well, why don't you just try? Why don't you just put the kidney and let's see what happens? But the surgeons knew that it would be more dangerous to put a defective kidney at that time in my system, which would make me far more ill, than it was best just to leave it alone. And you can understand the desperation, you can understand how desperate we were. So I didn't know how many years I would have to wait. However, I was lucky, alhamdulillah. On 5th of December 2009, I got another call. I didn't get excited, didn't tell anybody. Just my husband and I went to the hospital. I still had to be checked. I still had to be checked to see if I was well enough to have this transplant. There were other people called as well. And I had to, they did all the tests, and 12 hours later, I had my transplant, alhamdulillah. We've heard Altaf talk about 110 people, 1,100 people dying. I could have been that statistic. I could have died. If I didn't have that transplant, I would not be here, sitting here talking to you today. This is me after being very ill. The next slide is that this is actually me very well, considering after all the stuff that I had gone through. You see me now. I am, alhamdulillah, very fit, very well. The transplant has, alhamdulillah, lasted 10 years, and I please Allah make it last longer. Every day I thank Allah for all what I have, because I now have a baby, I have a child, and this has been because of a transplant. I am well and I'm fit. I can do all the normal things. I can eat things that we take for granted, things, even going to the bathroom, even going and drinking a glass of water, 2 liters, 3 liters. We take all these things for granted, and we should be thanking, you know, I feel so blessed. And every day I pray for the donor, the person that had consented, the person that had taken their time to consider and sign in that. Side has indicated that you have to sign a donor card, you have to take that time, and this is before the opt-out. So I feel blessed, alhamdulillah, that I am here today. It's hard when you have a family, and it's hard with our community. With our community, we didn't do a lot of talking. Today we're talking a lot more because of the organizations that we're now involved with, because of BAME, because of Kidney Research UK, working with the BAME community. It's really important that we talk to each other. I know a lot of sisters and a lot of talks that I've been at, where some people have come to me and said that they're so scared to talk to their family. It's so taboo that they don't know how to approach it. The best thing, first of all, is to go to your organizations, to go to communities that you know that can assist you, to go to BAME, go to Kidney Research UK, and try and join someone that you can talk to first. Seek out counsellors, seek out someone that you can talk to before you go to your community. But there are people out there that are listening, and I hope anybody that is facing the same thing, that are facing illness or possibility of their kidneys being damaged in the future, or possibilities of their kidneys failing in the future, I'm happy to talk, answer any questions. I'm happy for any questions to be asked to me. I'm very open, honest about what I've gone through, and any question will not be embarrassing to me. So please, if you want to ask me any questions, please do.
So thank you very much, Jelina. That was very heartfelt, a long journey, I am sure. So that brings it back home. Why do people like Jelina go through this difficult condition? Lupus is a rare disease, but there are more common diseases which affect us. So I'm moving swiftly on to Neerja Jain, who has been working in this field for quite a long time, looking at BAME community issues, or why we as a community need more organs. What diseases are affecting us? What inequalities in healthcare exist? So Neerja Jain, please, over to you. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Saeed, and thank you very much to BAME and colleagues for inviting me today. I'm delighted to be here from my home in Northamptonshire on this Sunday, which brings us to the end of actually National Organ Donation Week. Now, we've just heard from Jelina. Now, if you're not persuaded after hearing Jelina's story, I don't know what will convince you. I've known Jelina a long time, and every time I hear a story, it's like the first time, and it really gets me here. And it reminds me why I still do what I do, even if it is on a Sunday evening. Right, so I'm just going to share my slides here. I hope you can all see that. I'm just going to give you a very brief overview about some of the work we're doing at Kidney Research UK to address kidney health and organ donation inequalities. It will be a brief overview, so I've just put my email and phone there if you would like to contact me for further information, but you can also visit our website. So in terms of need and background, some of this has been covered, so I'll just quickly go through. At the last census, BAME, or Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, represented 14% of the UK population. I don't like that term either. Like, we are actively looking at trying to break that down, and where we can, we are breaking it down so that you have the specific information for each ethnic or religious group. South Asians only represent about 7.5% of the UK population, but some of the things you've heard today, just to make it absolutely crystal clear that we as a group are more likely to need a transplant. We're less likely to donate, and yet more likely to wait longer for a donation. In terms of registration onto the NHS Organ Donor Register, the BAME communities really are very poorly represented. And unfortunately, what makes it a double whammy is that many people still seem to be unaware of the health issues that can lead someone to for their organs to fail, whether it's a heart, lung, liver, anything. And one of the things that always strikes me when we're out and about, normally pre-COVID, raising awareness, is that people don't realise, for example, that diabetes and high blood pressure, which are very common in the South Asian communities, I'm sure you'll agree, are actually the leading causes of kidney failure. And people are aghast when they hear about this. They really don't realise. They think that maybe, you know, it's maybe it's drinking alcohol that makes your kidneys fail, but no, it's these two leading causes that we're all too familiar about. And they're even more shocked to hear that an South Asian person with diabetes is 10 times more likely to develop kidney failure compared to a white person with diabetes. And I think that sort of education needs to keep on coming out to make many people within our communities to stand up and really listen to why there's a need to address organ failure, and therefore look at the importance of organ donation to help save lives and enhance lives. There is, as we've seen, a lot of misinformation, a lot of fake news going about to do with organ donation, whether it's about the law, the process of organ donation, the myths around what is entailed, you know, talk of delayed burial, etc., etc. But I hope listening to Shaykh and doctors today, some of those misconceptions, some of those concerns have been alleviated. So overall, within our communities, there has been historically, and remains so, huge cultural and religious misconceptions, and therefore lack of knowledge. And that's been compounded by language barriers, which really inhibit the uptake of the right messages. And for a long time, and still to some extent now, there doesn't seem to be much of a link for community members. But fantastic work like what BAME is doing, other organisations, NHSBT, ourselves, we're trying to create that link. Very much so in terms of what we mean by that Kidney Research UK is people from the communities working at grassroots level. And we have been doing so in the whole area of kidney disease and related health, as well as organ donation, now, you know, for about 14, 15 years. And I'll tell you more about that shortly. We've formalised the sort of our approach to kidney health inequalities, if you like, by the production of a report, which you can see here, and which is available in both lay and a scientific format from our website. And it is for all the reasons that you've heard already. And we are so committed to it that actually, in terms of our strategic priorities now, health inequalities is something that is a cross-cutting theme and is embedded throughout all the research that we are conducting. But it's a very complex issue. There's a real complex interaction between ethnicity and socioeconomic group status. We know that people from South Asian and Black backgrounds are more likely to progress to kidney failure, and are 3 to 5 times more likely to start dialysis. They're much more likely to experience risk factors as well. And yet there is also a lower uptake of home therapies. And what I mean by that is a home dialysis, which we know has better clinical outcomes and better quality of life for patients. So there's a whole host of kidney health inequalities which we as a research charity are trying to address and do some more research around this. But it's not just about BAME inequalities. There's some other factors, other demographics, which also impinge upon a BAME person. So, for example, a younger person has a higher relative risk of having poor clinical outcomes from chronic kidney disease. We know that younger groups are tested less often. They often start renal replacement therapy at a later stage. And also older people are less likely to receive a kidney transplant. So you can really have a double or triple whammy if you're, say, South Asian, older, and you have diabetes. As a research charity, we're doing lots of research, but in this area in particular, we've got a whole program of work called Transforming Transplantation. And again, if you go onto our website, you can see the work that we're doing to try and make transplants last longer and work better. We also have a really brilliant well-being platform for kidney patients to help their physical and mental well-being, especially during lockdown. And this includes on-demand and live yoga, Pilates classes, for example, that suit all abilities. So I mentioned about volunteers. So these volunteers we call peer educators, and they are really helping us to address some of the inequalities. So who are they? They're empathetic, truly empathetic. They are representative of the target BAME community that we're trying to reach. So they really are the right messenger in terms of culture, faith, language, and even healthcare experience and literacy levels. So which really warms them to the community. The community feel that they're talking to someone like themselves. They come with a wealth of life experience. They're from all sorts of different socioeconomic, religious, ethnic backgrounds, and really do bring that to the fore. The whole peer educator model is a very simple, flexible model. We have trained peer educators to talk about early detection and prevention of disease, through to management of risk factors, right through to end of life and organ donation. The only thing I really insist on from peer educators is that they're passionate, and indeed they absolutely are passionate to give back to the NHS and to their communities. And we provide them with accredited training and support to deliver the right messages, so that they really are working and building capacity from bottom up, as it were, and helping their own communities, supported excuse me, by ourselves. And this is particularly heartwarming for me because I see the peer educators growing confidence with the opportunities that we're able to provide them. This is a picture of just some of the peer educators out there in the field wearing our fine purple branding. They're out there with their stands, their pop-up banners, leaflets, information in different languages, DVDs in different South Asian languages. We work closely with NHSBT, providing us with that information. And over the years, we have trained over 160 peer educators cross-section, engaged with tens of thousands of people in the main cities across the UK, and held events in all manner of places, of course, including places of worship and various community, cultural and social events. And we've been fortunate to get a lot of media opportunities as well. And thousands of people have signed up to the ODR. It is a proven and evidence-based model. This was an independent evaluation which was written up in Clinical Kidney Journal 5 years ago. And I'm really proud to say that all the completed organ donation projects have won awards, whether it's in Birmingham there on the left from the local CCG, in the centre there from the local authority, and that's Usha, who's one of our oldest peer educators, picking up an award. And there on the right is our Scottish team who picked an award as well. So really proud of them. Fantastic work they're doing. Thank you very much.
Just mute me, start mode. Okay, Neerja, thank you very much. It looks like Kidney Research UK have been doing a lot of work over a long period of time, and all of these things will take time. So we're coming now really to the climax, which is going to be the question and answer session. I'm going to bring in now a surgeon who probably has had more sleepless nights than many of us, because the things that these guys do in the middle of the night, transplanting the organs or retrieving the organs really need to understand a little bit. So we're going to have Dr. Shahid Farid, who is a transplant and hepatobiliary surgeon from Leeds. He's got a wide experience in this, and we're just going to have a few minutes with him, and then we'll jump straight into the Q&A. Thank you, Shahid.
Thank you, Saeed, and Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I am a transplant surgeon, but I'm also a multi-organ retrieval surgeon, that is to remove organs for transplantation. And it's a great opportunity to engage yet again with BAME on this important platform of trying to raise awareness of organ donation. The main topic in Islam revolves around the social, the Islamic, and the cultural issues and the barriers to transplantation. And the surgical aspect is important, and perhaps the discussion that we'll have and the questions is more important. Our first speaker highlighted inequalities between organ donation in the BAME community and those needing transplantation. Dr. Rashid, I think, in my opinion, has, as one of the scholars, one of the most clear debate, discussion, and opinion on the permissibility of transplantation. It's coherent, and it is rather important that his opinion is heard. Obviously, the heartfelt rendition of the importance of transplantation in people's life has been highlighted. But for me, it's important also to highlight quite quickly that there's also the issue of blood donation and bone marrow donation, not to be forgotten amongst other organs, and that we try to not only pursue and discuss the Islamic perspective, but also address this concept of making it normal to donate, the social norm of donating. We know that previous campaigns and drink driving have made it hard to choose not to because of the social media, the way that society pleads us not to do such things. For mental health now that's in the current limelight, and it's always talking about these things that makes a difference. I was asked specifically to talk about the concept of retrieval and what it involves, and I'll start with the DCD organ retrieval. That's removing organs from patients who will suffer cardiac death. That is when the heart stops. These are different to the concept of DBD or brain death organ retrievals, and it's important to realize the difference. The Sheikh mentioned the concept of mutilation, and that for me is a very important topic to dispel. There is no mutilation involved in the organ donation process for a variety of reasons, but predominantly also due to the fact that the operation has to be carried out delicately, because any damage to the organ will result in complications in the recipient. But if we talk about the donation after cardiac death concept, that is when somebody on intensive care will have their family told that the chances of recovery are minimal and non-existent. And although they don't meet the criteria for donation after brain death, they don't have neurological death, their chance of survival is futile, and they will at some point decide to remove the ventilation machine, stop the inotropes. And
feedback forms, you are seeing it in the chat box. Please fill in the feedback forms and also the Q&A, please. And there's a part A and part B. So in the Q&A, we have all the speakers, but we also have an extra speaker, which is Dr. Umar Aziz. He's a pediatric intensive care consultant and a pediatric clinical lead in organ donation as well in Bristol. So he's attending the Q&A with all the speakers that you've heard so far. So please put the questions in the chat box or raise your hand. But I've got a few questions to start with. I'm going to start really with Shahid because he didn't have a lot of time. Shahid, have you ever been in a situation where, in the case of a family who has to make a decision and they were seeking guidance, so this is in the middle of the night, where they're seeking guidance from a faith leader, and this has then persuaded them to do one thing or another? Because this is a scenario that does exist. So I don't know if you have any experiences of this as a transplanting surgeon, where you have to make the call that this donation is suitable, but is the family happy? And they then have a little bit of discussion between themselves and ask for a faith leader's opinion. Shahid, can you hear us? No, I don't think we got Shahid back online. Okay. Okay, fine. So we'll move on to the next question. Altaf, can you give us then the statistics that you have? Altaf, the statistics that you have, there's a question regarding the word family refusal rate. What does that mean at the time of donation, and what numbers do we have on that?
I don't have the number at hand, unfortunately, for that, but family refusal is generally pointing at looking at when the family has actually refused at the point of consent being taken from them. So that's when a person has passed away, is in the final stages, and there's been a discussion with them about organ donation, and it's where a decision's been made. But I don't actually have the number of that to hand, unfortunately.
That's okay. My understanding of that is there is a difference between, we don't like to call them BAME and non-BAME, white Caucasian versus BAME, from some of the readings I've done in that field. And actually, if we improved that little bit of area and brought it in line with everybody else, that would be a big boost to the numbers if you were thought of it. So this is where the campaign of awareness is. It shouldn't be left to that late stage that awareness didn't exist, and therefore when people are not aware, then the default position is not to donate, of course. That's what normally happens.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the discussion here is more about sharing your decision. So if you're going to opt in, then you can do that via, the organ donor register. You can actually go on there and opt in via that. But you can also opt in by letting your loved ones know the decision you've made, because it's going to be a difficult time for them. And so if they know the decision you made beforehand, you take that, you take that difficult question away from them. And that concern, so that you've already answered what your intention was. So it's really important that you share your decision as well.
Okay, thank you, Altaf, for that. Shahid, are you back online? Can you hear me?
I'm sorry. Yes, back online.
Yeah, Shahid, just the question of your personal experience as a transplant surgeon, where you found somebody suitable to procure the organs or take the organs, but then we have to wait for the family's decision, because that's important now. And where the decision has changed during the night, where you are, retrieving the organs. So you guys are out in the middle of the night. Can you explain, have you had any experiences where decisions are made in real time and it has affected what you are doing?
Sure. So I'm sorry about the apologies with technology. I am also an organ retrieval surgeon, and I've probably performed around 300 organ retrievals in my time. And I can only recollect one Muslim donor in that time over the last 8 years of organ retrieval. There are cases where we find that the SNODs, or that's the specialist nurse in organ donations, who have approached the families and have got consent, that the consent changes over the period of time. And that's because most families at the time of this tragic event are not clear as to where the family stands, and they wish to discuss it further with their local imam or somebody of senior faith in their community. And although they have already agreed to organ donation, once they've had that conversation with the imam, there has sometimes been a change in decision, and that means that we have to stand down. It's actually quite interesting that it could be in the same city with different postcodes, perhaps only 2 or 3 streets away from the local mosque, that there is a variation in opinion when it comes to what is permissible and what's not permissible. But certainly from my point of view, I have not performed organ retrieval on many Muslim organ donors, and I've not come across many. And there has been a significant number of changes of decision overnight, as you mentioned, when it comes to organ donation.
Sorry, Brother Saeed, can I possibly come in there just to add in a comment? So, Assalamu alaikum, I'm an intensivist by background, and just adding in on the comment on Brother Shahid there. So I've certainly had experience of Muslim families refusing based upon them not being aware of what the Muslim Islamic perspective or Islamic ruling on organ donation is. And in that situation, it's often a very emotive time for them from that point of view, and they don't necessarily have the headspace to actually explore that per se. So events such as this will allow wider discussion, and also that sort of perspective on what is the Islamic ruling, because having that discussion and trying to research as to what the organ sort of donation permissibility in Islam is in a very emotive time when your loved one is having end-of-life care from that point of view makes it even more difficult, in my opinion, anyway.
Thank you, Umar. Thank you very much for the additional opinion. I'm going to move on to Shaykh Rafaqat now. Really, the question of these words we use, DBD and DCD. A lot of people are comfortable with cardiovascular death, where I simply say the heart stopped and lungs stopped and the patient is classically what we recognize not breathing. Is there provision? So the question, is there provision to ask for that as the only way of donating in the question of deemed consent? So you'll say, I am happy to do that only if I have a DCD death.
Well, I think there's a couple of things really. The first thing is the question of whether organ donation is permissible or not permissible. And I think we're getting a lot of research that's coming through, I think, from the academic perspective, which is demonstrating and telling us that even though people do accept that organ donation is permissible, there is a quite large cohort amongst them. They still have certain misconceptions in terms of what the organ transplantation process entails. So I think there's something about education that is required in there as well. So it's not just solely about whether somebody believes it's permissible or not. Now we're differentiating, and I'm going to use sort of general terms rather than going to the technical terminology, but generally speaking, you're talking about somebody who's donating an organ after brain death, somebody who's donating an organ after cardiovascular death or heart death. Yeah, and these are the two things that we sort of differentiate when we talk about organ donation, because these are the two processes that individuals go through when they die. Now, I have a certain objection from the Islamic perspective, because I'm talking solely from an Islamic perspective. And for those of you who have the ability to read the article or get the chance to read my article, which is quite extensive, goes into a lot of detail, it sort of indicates that, you know, from an Islamic perspective, we don't differentiate between the two. And what that really means is that from the Islamic perspective, permanent loss of consciousness is what is the essence of what we're looking at. Now, it so happens that the brain plays a very important role in that, especially the brainstem. And that is the way our biology is, but that's the concept we're looking at. So if your heart stops functioning, so you have what we call a heart arrest or a cardiac arrest. Your heart is arrested. I like Gardner's terminology. He's a new paper that's come out just recently, and it really does align itself more so from what Islam would consider to be the more viable approach to this. And that is that when we talk about the idea of brain death, reality is, let's just move away from that. Let's talk about it in terms of brain arrest. Just like you have cardiac arrest, you have brain arrest. What does brain arrest mean? Brain arrest means that when the blood flow to the brain stops, and legally or morally, it is permanently in that situation. For that reason, that person is no longer with us from that point onwards, and that person would be considered as, from the Islamic perspective, as being dead. So arguments come across, you know, so we can go into a lot of technical detail when we start looking at heart death, brain death, because new arguments keep arising, you see. So even when somebody says, oh, look, I'm happy to accept brain death now, what tends to happen is somebody else will bring another argument and say, look, hang on, did you know there are different standards? In Netherlands, they have a different standard. In US, they have a whole brain standard. In somebody else, in UK, they have the brainstem standard. The reality is, this is just, from an Islamic perspective, this is just a farce. You know, reality is that all these standards are, in essence, forming a criterion according to their legal system in accepting an idea of what would they, at what point they would decide that a person should be considered as having died. And from Islamic perspective, a lot of the time, you know, it's just on the level of permanence. There's a lot of confusion about terminologies as well, by the way, and that's about irreversibility. So people talk about, and I think a lot of that confusion has arisen from the fatwa that they're quite old now, but they talk about irreversibility, and people are misunderstanding what it means by irreversibility, getting confused with what that means with permanence. It's a very philosophical discussion. I'm not going to go into the details, but the main point to take from this is you don't need to worry about cardiac death or brain death. The main point is, if organ transplantation is accepted from the Islamic perspective out of zarura or necessity, then either way would work. However, the most important point to take from this is the dead donor rule is an important part of this. The dead donor rule means, as Dr. Farid was mentioning earlier on, is related to that sort of time period you give when you switch off the machines, and you want to know whether there will be auto resuscitation. What does that mean? That means whether the person, their heart will come back and start beating again without any kind of intervention. So that would be the only indication from an Islamic perspective where we'll think, whoa, hold on. This person has come back through intervention, yeah, without any intervention. So other than that, and we have a lot of very strong evidence to suggest that after 2 minutes, in virtually every single case, these individuals do not come back from auto resuscitation, but we rather, what we do is we put machines back on again and we start perfusing them again. And that's what brings their heart back. Now, that is a debate in itself, which people are getting confused. Some very prominent ulama are getting very confused about that. I've even sat in with some conferences where we've had neuroscientists try to explain this, but that confusion still exists. And there is a lot of messages going out there at the moment, which is scaremongering. And it's completely misappropriation and misunderstanding of the processes. So it's very important that we are informed properly. And I think sometimes discussions can be so detailed, it's very difficult for a lay person to understand that. So what you have to do is you just have to trust certain individuals that they understand it and they give a good, they have an informed response to that. And that's the way people need to just sometimes accept it.
Okay, Jazakallah, Sheikh. So we've got quite a few questions coming through. I'm going to go to Shahid next, and then after that, I'm going to Altaf and then Jelina. Shahid, you had a comment to make?
Very briefly, this concept and discussion around DBD and DCD, believe it or not, is very important. There is some misconception, as the Sheikh has mentioned, and there are some recent fatwas that have not actually cleared up that issue. From a clinician and from a patient point of view, there is a difference between the organs. However, the outcomes of organs from DBD settings are far better than that of the DCD setting. So that's important to realise. The other issue is of this no touch time. This is the time where there is no blood supply continually happening in the body, therefore there's more deterioration of the organ. In America, in parts of America, the no touch time is 2 minutes. In the UK, we use 5 minutes. But that 5 minutes does result in deterioration in the organ function. Now, for certain organs like kidneys, they're very resilient and then they do quite well. And the lungs also, but the heart and the liver particularly do not suffer ischemia well. And this additional 5 minutes of ischemia time, plus the time to get to the theatre, plus the time to start the perfusion fluid, all adds to the injury. So the outcome of DCD organs is not as favourable. Now, there's new technology coming in that allows for organs to be put on machines and keep them going outside the body. But the important concept that the Sheikh has mentioned, for me as a clinician, is very important, that DCD and DBD concepts are permissible in Islam. And that's important for me to highlight.
Okay, thank you very much. Altaf, I'm going to come to you. Are you still online?
Yes, I am.
Altaf, the question is, what is, do you know what the wait time is for white Caucasian versus non-white Caucasian, i.e. the word BAME? So people from ethnic minorities, what is the wait time now? What is the difference between the two?
I'm not sure of that figure. I don't have it at hand, unfortunately. Right. But I know that there is a slightly because obviously with organ donation it depends on what organ as well that you're waiting for. Mm-hmm. But I do understand that there is a slight difference between the two.
So one of the concepts is people who are from the ethnic minorities on the waiting list are more than likely to get a white Caucasian kidney than from the BAME community. So they're more likely to receive, but we also know on the other side, the common concept, we say less likely to give. Is that true? Altaf again.
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't quite get all of that.
Patients who are on the transplant waiting list, whichever organ, let's say kidney in my field, those who are from BAME community are more likely to receive a white Caucasian kidney than from a BAME kidney.
That does ring true to some extent. But I think kind of like with certain organs, ethnicity matters, and an ethnic match, you know, significantly improves the situation. I think kidneys is one of those. So kind of like, I'm not 100% sure, and I don't want to kind of like, you know,
yeah,
give
from a
any.
nephrology perspective, we know that is usually the case. The tissue type and the blood grouping are different in BAME communities versus non-BAME. So hence, there's going to be a natural bias of people waiting longer. Thank you for that. So Jelina, I just want to bring you in here.
Hi there. Hi. Yeah.
You said you waited 4.5 years.
Yeah, that's right. 4.5 years.
What about live donation? Was there any option, or did you have to wait on the waiting list, waiting for, I assume, a white kidney is what you got at the end?
Well, I don't know because you're not informed. So I saw some comments. I know someone named Fudge was saying that. Now, in terms of my family, the difficulty was I had systemic lupus erythematosus. And when I was diagnosed, they said that the lupus was causing the inflammation to the kidney. So at that time, no one knew if I were to be given a live kidney from my family. Let's say my sister came forward, and the difficulty was, what if I had that transplant, I've gone through that transplant, and then the lupus attacked that kidney? No one knew. So that was one of the issues. So there's lots of medical issues. Then we had the issue of my parents having diabetes. So we heard from Neerja saying diabetes can eventually cause your kidneys to fail. Then with my sister, we're talking going back 20 years ago as well. My sister was young, and there was a lot of doctors were reluctant because she hadn't had any children, she's younger than me, and the other aspect of that was, what if she needed a kidney? A lot of people end up when they're pregnant and babies, and when they're having babies, there's issues with that. And there was just, if she had children, that might have changed the perspective, but because she hadn't, that was one of the issues. So there was lots of issues. This is the problem. It's not one, it's another.
Yeah.
I know someone else made a comment. I think Samir also commented that there was some issues that when people had a donor, they reacted differently. Alhamdulillah, I had no reaction. Actually, I felt blessed, and I think a lot of it is due to your brain. If you think positively and you do your prayers and you think, you tune in correctly and positively, then I truly believe that the brain also has a lot to ensure that kidney works and attach itself. If you think negatively, those negative signals will then cause problems as well. So positive mental attitude has a lot to do with keeping positive, and has a lot with your body, and I truly believe that. I think that helped a lot. So I think someone was saying people were aggressive. I didn't think of that person. I thought that was my Firista, we call it Firista angel. This is someone that has come forward. This is my Firista. I'm very blessed for this person keeping me alive. I feel like I am being watched over by my relatives that have passed away, and watching me and taking care of me, and my Firista's angels looking after me. So I feel very blessed.
Thank you very much. Now, as you imagine, life on dialysis is really horrible. As you've probably been through it, I know about patients going through it. You get desperate. What about assessment in your own mind of risk? Transplant is not without risk, but obviously dialysis is risky as well. So you want to move one lot of risk to another risk. How much did that play on your mind, or were you just really wanting that kid? Because we know, as I work as a transplant physician, we have to inform you of the risk. It's not zero, that you're not going from very high risk on dialysis to zero risk. What did you feel?
Well, it's with the dialysis, I had gone through so much that I had peritoneal dialysis first, and with peritoneal dialysis, that didn't work. I ended up ballooning, and so when I went on to chemodialysis, I actually feared, what if that didn't work? And if that didn't work, that was it, really. Now, I didn't say it to a lot of people. I don't think a lot of people understand. If I did not have hemodialysis, let's say if I did have any form of dialysis at all, within 2 weeks, all the urea, all the poison that's in my system will eventually die. I'll eventually die within 2 weeks. It's a slow, horrible death, and and I know a lot of people that have come off dialysis. There are places in Scotland where there are islands where people have to fly in through helicopter, take a ferry to come in to have dialysis in the mainland. This is in the UK. You'd think that they might have dialysis machines out there. No, they don't. So they come all the way into the mainland to have dialysis. I know of a young, a 20-year-old boy who I heard that decided that was it. He couldn't do this. It was his whole day doing this 3 times a week, 5 hours each time. It's tiring. And when you're talking about taking that risk, yeah, I was prepared to have that organ and take that risk, because it's 5 hours stuck to a machine and all things go through your head. And eventually you think, what if the dialysis doesn't work? And that's why I could see from the statistics, I'm fully involved with Kidney Research UK. The research is immense. It really is. You can see from, I've seen babies having their father's kidneys put in them, and that kidney is wrapped up and it's tied in and it's put in and it's been working. If people look into the research, they'll be very shocked to see how much has advanced even over 10 years.
So thank you very much for that. Yeah, very important stories as well. I want to move on now to really Neerja Jain. I just want to bring you in here regarding people's desperation and these health inequalities that exist. We've known about them for a long period of time. What is it about the BAME community that we can't seem to crack? Is it generational? Is it cultural? It's probably everything. But you've been working in this area for a long period of time. You've probably had a lot of experiences. Why can't we shift this movement and, you know, get it into where we are in 2020?
Yeah, it's a combination of things, really, Saeed. You know, and you've touched on it. Some of it is definitely generational. We know that there are attitudinal changes with second, third generations who are much more aware of health issues. They're much more inclined to want to donate. But of course, whilst it's a great thing that we need to share our decision with our loved ones, and ultimately it's our next of kin currently who will make that decision. So it's all well and good for younger generations to say, yes, I'd like my organs donated, and they may even be brave enough to have that conversation with their elders. But if their elders aren't agreeable, they will not carry out those wishes. So there is a slow sea change, I think, happening, and definitely all the time we've been doing this, people are much more aware. But it's a long, hard slog, I think, ahead of us still.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And with the law change that we've had in May 2020 and is coming in other parts of the UK, it's going to take 3 to 5 years, is my understanding of changing people's perception. The law changes overnight, but the perceptions and thinking take 3 to 5 years. So although we've done 10 of these, we're nowhere near the middle of our work. So it's a long road. So thank you for that. Umar, can I come to you? Umar Aziz, can I come to you with a question from the chat box by Samir? What is the panel's opinion why SNODs, so staff nurse and organ donation, or doctors or CRODs, are reluctant to bring up topic of donation for ethnic minorities? Is that the case or not?
So, so all patients who are certainly dying on the intensive care unit from a pediatric perspective, and the same should be applying for the adult intensive care unit. Our approach with the SNODs, approaching for in terms of having that active discussion about organ donation, and that's regardless of ethnicity or background. Inherently, I'm sure there's a sort of a mental bias even amongst healthcare professionals as to who will and who will not likely respond to that donation process positively, i.e. what family were likely to proceed towards donation. I'm sure there's an inherent stereotype within all our minds from that point of view, and that's just human nature. But certainly the discussion about organ donation is actively sort of engaging all families of patients who are passing away on the intensive care unit. And just to reiterate that, out of all the deaths within the UK, only 1% of patients, and this regardless of ethnicity, only 1% of patients are in a position where they might be suitable for organ donation. So I think that just emphasizes how very precious even each donor is from that point of view.
Thank you very much. Shaykh Rafaqat, I've got a question for you, which is probably the most important of all these questions. is what's going on? Nodes. I'll just cut that from the white patients. Yeah. Just let me just look at the chat box, see if there's anything else before I go to the Shaykh. So the question is to the Shaykh: if the Muslim faith leader is a crucial opinion that people seek at the time when they will need to make a decision. You mentioned in your Al-Baig Academy that you were almost teaching the ulama as well to have this approach that you have. How successful have you been in that? The Shaykh still here online? No. Okay. All right. That's fine. We'll move on. Okay, that's fine. I think Shaykh had to leave on time, so we couldn't answer that particular question. We'll move on to Shahid next again. Shahid, with your experience of working in the organ retrieval area over these years, just give a perspective to the audience, what's happening behind the scenes when somebody's on intensive care, your team then move in after somebody's given informed consent and the family agree, because a lot of your work is done behind the scenes, out of hours, and just give us a perspective on how much that is going on. Because I don't think, I realize it when I get a phone call in the middle of the night from guys like you saying, we've got this organ, would you accept it, from the SNOD or the organ donor retrieval coordinator. But how many hours are spent and what kind of things you are guys doing? Because I don't think the public understand your position, what you're doing, and how much hard work you're putting in.
So once an organ donor is notified to NHSBT, you wouldn't believe the cascade of events that it creates, not just for one team, for one kidney in one city, but for multiple organs up and down the country, from the heart to the lungs, to the pancreas, to the kidneys, to the liver, to the small bowel. So you can actually have up to 7 teams being notified, centres around the country that then involve 7 recipients, that involve calling them in and letting 7 different ICU departments know that transplants are happening. So there's a whole cascade of events that occurs. And while the organ donation consent has been taken, there are scouts that go around to check on the physiology of the donor. There's discussions with the intensivist regarding the blood results. So the SNOD acts as a conduit of information. And for every half hour, there's updates that are continually happening to the transplant team, to the implanting surgeon. So I'm aware as a liver transplant surgeon, the latest blood pressure to make sure that they're not having low blood pressure, etc. And so there's a lot of things happening behind the scenes when it comes to organ donation. But then there's also a lot of safety checks for the recipient also. So there's a whole screen that we have with regard to viruses, to behaviors, to health questionnaires, to previous cancer history, alcohol history, social history, smoking history, that all impact on the decision to proceed with the organ donor. So there's a lot of things that are happening behind closed doors and behind the scenes. And then eventually when we get to the organ donation centre, the process is almost repeated again. Another series of checks of identification, consent, authority from the coroner, any special wishes from the family, any special wishes from the coroner regarding the body, and then the actual particular rights around the dressing of the body towards the end of the operation. We take that on board, and so the transplant team is aware of the various things that the family wish for or the religion asks for, and then that's catered right along the actual operation itself. So
in the case of a Muslim family who were deemed it's permissible to donate and they're given permission and the donor also had a donor card or had said so, is there any delay from that Muslim family taking their loved one to be buried in a swift manner like we do, and you guys coming in to retrieve the appropriate organs?
So, you know, by and large, the delay is minimal. We are all aware of both the Judaism and the Islamic traditions of trying to arrange for the burial the next day or as quickly as possible. And for the vast majority of people, that can be done after visceral organ donation. There's issues whether or not they become donors for bone, tendons and other tissues. But by and large, if you've donated a kidney or a liver, there shouldn't be too delay to burial. Most of that can be arranged quite quickly.
Good, right, thank you very much. There doesn't seem to be any further questions. I'm now going to really say thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to Jelina, especially as a patient. Thank you very much to the audience. We maxed out, I think, over 160 people at one point in this. So, Jazakallah khair for everyone. We have some further events for BAME coming up. Please stay tuned to the BAME website, to the BAME forthcoming events. One is on ethics and Islam, as you can see on your screen right now. Another one is Islamic medicine. We are active in this area. The next big event is Lifesavers at the end of this month on the 26th of September, which should be happening in your massages nearby. And we hope to get a lot more than 70 massages that we had last year. So I think this has been a great webinar, lots to learn. If you want to get in contact with us, in the chat box, you will see our email address. You can get us through the webinar address, i.e. through the website. This is recorded and will be going out again as a recording for those who missed it. Jazakallah khair for everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.